What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco, where I have a lot of negative things I could say about social media. The account on Twitter and Instagram, Left in the Bay, is definitely not one of them. They are uncovering images and histories where I and everyone whose opinion I consider to be the correct opinion wants to be in the Bay. So you may or may not have known about events like the Hunters Point Uprising or the longtime project, the People's Food System. And they're introducing new people to the anti-cop action that happened on May 21st. When we're recording this in 1979, the White Night Riots. But today we're going to talk about a piece that appears in Notes from Below that will be included in the show notes. Read it. It's a great piece connecting the South African apartheid struggle to today's resistance to Zionism, and particularly how the Bay Area's struggle against apartheid looked in the 70s and 80s. Matt Ray and Matt Wranovics are going to talk a little bit about Left in the Bay as a project, and then we're going to get into this excellent piece. And don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/SadFrancisco to find past episodes, as well as throw us some cash to help us pay for the editing of the show and for some of the tech things that are required to get the show out to you. Thank you to everyone who's helping us out. So Matt and Matt are here. Matt Wranovics, Matt Ray from Left in the Bay, which I know there is a lot of shit that we could talk about social media, and Left in the Bay is not one of them. I am particularly stoked to have them on because we're going to be talking about encampments of the past and of today and of the future here in the Bay, how encampments around South African apartheid and how encampments around the pro-Palestine movement have a lot of things in common. I guess to start, would you mind talking a little bit about who is Left in the Bay? When did you start the project? And do you want to say a little bit about what you all do?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. We're kind of, identify as a small research collective, kind of, social media archival project. Mostly it's like two guys named Matt. It's me, Matt, and Matt. But, we have other conspirators. We've had an intention for a while to grow the thing into a collective, but it's kind of moved over the past few years in kind of just organic way. And, our intention is to kind of build it out into a collective at some point. We kind of just started with like an Instagram and a Twitter account. This was something we'd been thinking about for a while. I would say I think like some of the documents that we originally started working with, we kind of started organizing in as long ago as like 2016, 2017. We'd been thinking about this because, there was obviously a kind of anti-fascist movement mobilizing and ramping up in the wake of Trump's election. Groups like DSA and PSL got a big Trump bump, and there was a lot of kind of nascent political activity happening in the Bay. And for, in some ways, political activity that hadn't happened for a little while. But we're also in a period where like the Bay, obviously over the past 30, 40 years, has had an enormous demographic shift. There's people here from all over the place. There's a lot of people that are from the Bay that are gone. There's huge gaps in memory of struggle. There's, in certain ways, a lack of continuity and of generational memory to kind of transmute histories of struggle and popular struggle. So we've been thinking about this for a while, but it really got started in 2021 is when we officially kind of started the thing and named it. But yeah, we run social media accounts on Instagram and Twitter, and we have a website that'll be up pretty soon. That's who we are. The lockdown in 2020 really gave us some time to build structure for this thing. And also the kind of mass movements and anti-police struggles of 2020 gave us a sense of urgency to try and connect these kind of new and burgeoning political formations with the radical history of the Bay, which I think is really influential to the history of the left in the country and is just really under-researched, especially compared to places like New York City. So we're just trying to kind of play a part in popularizing this history, activating this memory. It was really a way to become more familiar with it ourselves. We're not experts or anything.
If I could add something to that while agreeing with and co-signing everything that the other Matt just said, I think that there's something that we were concerned about is that in the Bay Area in particular, there's a way that like the history of the left and the history of social struggles of various kind have been really effectively co-opted into the way that power sort of expresses itself locally. There's a lot of like pretty obvious examples of this, but I mean, you could just drive around the Bay Area and you'll see things like, city sanctioned murals of the Black Panthers and things in Berkeley that pay tribute to the civil rights movement and the movements of the 1960s there. And there's this kind of like toothless way that a lot of these histories that are quite dangerous have been kind of cartoonized and turned into like a very safe, sort of palatable narrative that often plays into this kind of local exceptionalism about like, look how progressive this place is and always has been. And so we really wanted to kind of combat that in a pretty concrete way by filling in a lot of the details of these things that people only know as kind of broad stroke cartoons like the Black Panther Party or whatever. And that was a big part of what this project was intended to be.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, you have succeeded in that. I appreciate you all for, giving me an outlet for if I'm feeling down on some of the movement work that I'm doing in the Bay, I can check some of the past movement work that has happened here to remind me of some of the successes, also some of the flops of the past, but like certainly like even those flops, like they can be something that we can learn from. Also, like it's sometimes helpful for me just to recognize that, like the mayors in San Francisco have always been right leaning. It's useful for me to like have that in my mind if I'm like getting down on like local politics and, the way that I guess democracy locally gets weaponized to, as you say, co-opt some of the more radical movement work that has been done in the Bay Area for forever. So
hey, we're glad to hear you say that. And I think you actually pointed to another thing that I think part of the project is about, which is helping people recognize sort of patterns and cycles of struggle to see like where similar things have kind of happened before so that they can actually like learn from these experiences that otherwise they might not know anything about. I know later we're going to get into it, but that's what we were thinking about when we wanted to write about the 1985 anti-apartheid encampments at Berkeley and elsewhere, is that we realized that a lot of these young people who are, very courageously going out and setting up these Gaza solidarity camps all over right now might not recognize the extent to which they're playing out and relearning a strategy that already was put into place in a particular kind of way in the same place that they're doing it. And it's good if we can learn lessons from these things that have been done before rather than just kind of letting them sort of fade away into the froth of history and getting kind of erased.
Yeah, so important to recognize that the work that's being done right now is not being done in a vacuum. And in fact, like particularly in the Bay Area, there is a super rich history of radical action around movements for liberation. And to that end, do you have favorite like local archives or libraries or people that you look to when you're uncovering some of this movement history?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's probably way more than we could name here, and I'm sure we'll miss some that we'll think about after this. But just some of the ones that come to mind, like San Francisco State has the labor archives, which are a really incredible resource, and some comrades are out there doing really incredible work. San Francisco and Oakland's public library reading room and Oakland's history room in particular are really incredible and worth visiting if your other listeners haven't been. Freedom Archive is a really incredible community archive here and a really great resource. They just moved, I think maybe a year or two ago, from San Francisco to Berkeley, and they have a really great new space in North Berkeley. Found SF is pretty crucial to our project, I would say. Like the work of shaping San Francisco and Found SF really laid out and continues to lay out some really incredible work. their project was a huge inspiration to us. And we've been collaborating on some events that we're going to put on with Shaping San Francisco too. So we're pretty excited about that. The Internet Archive also is, which is based out here and has their facility in the Richmond, is, though it is kind of frustrating to search through sometimes, is obviously an enormous and invaluable resource. There's other stuff too, like the Bay Area Lesbian Archive. Eastside Arts Alliance has a community archive above Bandung Book. Delirium Books, not a library or an archive, is effectively both. You can get into that back room. And they're a really cool radical bookstore in the Mission that, in my opinion, has the best billboard in town. Sits right on Mission and just says fighting commodity fetishism with commodity fetishism since 1981.
Love it.
Really wonderful people.
So,
but those are, that's a lot to name already, but there's plenty of others too.
Yeah, no, that's a good start for people who are interested in looking even deeper into some of this history. Definitely have used the Freedom Archives in the past, and for sure, Shaping San Francisco is hugely useful. I've cited them quite a bit on this very podcast. So today we're going to talk through this piece that you all put out last month, some of the encampments that have been going on in some cases for months, like encampments on college campuses. Some, I believe it was Stanford, had one going on for months starting last year. But as we've seen just the past few weeks, there have been encampments, UCSF, Berkeley, CCSF, City College, at State, USF. Am I forgetting any in the Bay?
A bunch. Well, San Jose popped off within the last couple of weeks. Santa Cruz started on May 1st.
Yeah.
I mean, Davis, Davis, the bigger Bay Area, but the greater Bay Area. But Davis has it still going.
Yeah. And I mean, I even want to claim Humboldt a little bit for the Bay in this case because of what they accomplished by, taking over couple buildings for a while and just getting a lot of eyes on the topic and stirring up some drama that will hopefully mean that the administrations of some of these CSUs have to grapple with where their money is being invested, how much these administrators at colleges are service people for the elites and investors in the colleges, basically. Also should note that the SFPD sent cops to Humboldt 6 hours away to put down that little rebellion up at Humboldt. That's the extent of it, is the cops up in Humboldt were not able to tamp down the movement up there. So some of our cops went up, on our overtime. The overtime bill will be sent to the people of San Francisco. But I wanted to talk through this piece, which, for being something that you can read in one sitting, it's pretty solid and something that anyone who has been at these encampments or curious about these encampments should read. We will link to it in the show notes. And it compares some of the ways that South African apartheid struggles and Palestine liberation struggles, some of the things that they have in common and some takeaways as well. What spurred you all to write the piece?
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say that, when the first big encampment, started making headlines at Columbia, and obviously we were all very impressed and inspired by it, a lot of attention we noticed was being given to the historical memory of 1968, as it should be. We should be talking about 1968. And a lot of people were talking about the movement at Columbia in 68 that saw a massive occupation, very, very militant occupation of the same building where the Columbia students were holed up recently, that eventually, was cleared quite violently and sort of sowed the seeds of the Weather Underground being formed. But we noticed that relatively few people, very few people, not nobody, but very few, were calling attention to a movement that's more recent and that we thought actually had a lot more in common with what we're seeing right now than 68 did, which is the 1985 anti-apartheid encampment movement, which swept college campuses across the country and saw these very militant, very ultimately successful protest encampments where students very single-mindedly, to their credit, were demanding campus divestment from a racist government abroad, namely South Africa. The 1968 movement was a lot more complex. It was part of this enormous international revolutionary struggle that had reverberations and dimensions in just about every part of social life. It was about the way that we're going to live in the world. It was huge and inchoate and scrambling and crazy. And these Gaza solidarity encampments are not that. They're quite orderly. Their attention is focused on a single subject. It's an internationalist cause with one focus, and where they're saying American involvement in this horrendous racist crime going on abroad is linked to our institution. Our institution is funding this process, and we're going to put pressure wherever we can on our institution to remove their financial support for what's going on overseas. And like the 85 movement, this current movement has been very committed to this strategy of what's effectively mass nonviolent civil disobedience, which is something that I think on the hard left gets a bad rap sometimes because its efficacy is definitely limited as a political tool. I don't think anybody would argue that nonviolent civil disobedience can stop the war. Something it probably can do is induce universities to divest from an apartheid state. And we know that because it happened in 1984, 1985, 1986.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that there's obviously a lot of similarities to look at with the 80s. And I think it's fair, too, that there are comparisons going on to the movement of the 1960s, which was obviously highly animated by the war in Vietnam. This, too, unlike the kind of occupation movement that erupted around South Africa, is really about a U.S. war, effectively. I mean, the U.S. is directly funding the genocide of Palestinians. So there are obvious comparisons, and I think the movements today have inherited various lessons from different generations of struggles, including the 1960s. But the similarities were just so striking for the 1980s, and the demands are so pretty much exactly the same that we just thought it was worthwhile to try to write this and kind of show people what that looks like. I think, too, the really interesting thing is that, like each generation of student struggle that's emerged since the 1960s, students have either rediscovered or highlighted the heavily involved role of the university with the U.S. military. That happened in the 1960s, that happened in the 1980s, that's happening today. And students are either finding out for themselves or really putting the bullhorn on the direct kind of role that universities, especially the University of California, which we could talk a whole lot about outside of this, has in U.S. military involvement here and overseas. But I mean, I think we should talk about what some of these similarities look like.
Yeah,
obviously just the form of struggle itself, or the kind of tactical decisions that are being made. The occupation, they weren't always called occupations in the 1980s. Occupying was talked about a lot. A lot of them were called sit-ins. They weren't always tent encampments. And I mean, some of them are being called sit-ins today. I think it is important, and I'm glad you mentioned the Stanford encampment that started last year and went for over 120 days, I believe, because it didn't really get a lot of attention. And it obviously, Columbia was what put, kind of development of the Gaza Solidarity encampments on the map for a lot of other schools and transmuted that struggle across the country. But that's another interesting similarity, because a similar thing happened in the 1980s. The student occupation wave for South African divestment really kicked off in a big way in the late 1970s. So after that, in the early 80s, there was a huge ebb in the movement. And in 1985, in the spring, there was an occupation at Columbia, and it again kind of erupted a new wave of struggle. Some of the timing of it was really interesting. It also occurred in April. So, I mean, some of this is obviously contingent on the kind of cycle of student struggles that, are a fact of student life and the organization of what the school year looks like. I think there's just a lot of similarities to the cycles of struggle that we're seeing and comparing, including just that there were continuous cycles of occupations that would be broken up. Sit-ins would be, crushed by police. Hundreds of students would be arrested. And then students, either the next day, sometimes the next month, sometimes the next semester, would just come back and rebuild the encampment or the occupation.
Yeah, it's useful to remember, like how the persistent work in the case of the anti-apartheid South Africa movement was required to eventually see success. Yeah, I think it's also interesting about Colombia having worked in traditional news media for a couple decades, how like if something doesn't happen in New York, I guess still you won't see it. It's like it didn't happen in the
Yeah.
traditional news media. And I think
Mhm.
some of that is going away with social media as it should, but it still remains to a certain extent. So
Something that just
oh yeah.
briefly, I'm sorry to interrupt, just to add to the note that a similarity you see is that students would get busted up and then come right back instead of camp again. I think an element to that that's worth adding is that sometimes they would leave on their own accord after getting kind of a bad deal, like getting a deal from the university administration, like we're going to investigate our investments and create a report, that sort of thing. And then they would leave and then they would just come back with the same demand. There's this incredible kind of like inexhaustible energy that I think in some ways relates to the simplicity of the demand, which is just divest, that you see in both movements, that enables students to just kind of keep returning. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that is yeah, useful. And we could also talk about question I had, the divestment focus as a tactic in the South African struggle. What do you know about that and why that singular request or demand, sorry, was so central to the actions that were happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s?
I think, yeah, the first thing to understand about the apartheid South Africa and the relationship between the United States and apartheid South Africa is that South Africa was a very key US ally in the region because they were such a committed anti-communist regime. So because of the realities of Cold War politics, even American conservatives were kind of appalled by the incredibly severe racism of apartheid South Africa. Support for it was pretty unshakable at the federal level. And so organizers and activists in solidarity with the people of South Africa, with the Black community there, I think pretty quickly realized that they didn't have the leverage to affect federal policy at that level. And so divestment kind of emerges as a tactic because it's something that you can actually put your hands around, right? So divestment, these campaigns aren't just taking place at universities. There's also divestment campaigns at the municipal level, where municipalities are being demanded to divest investments they have in companies that do business in South Africa. It's happening at the level of various industries and workplaces. It's happening at the state level. It's happening all over the place because there's a kind of, you can sort of envision a path to victory with it, where you can organize a key group of people to exert a relatively low pressure demand on a particular institution. You have a much better chance of winning than just going out in the streets and saying, stop funding and arming this racist government abroad. It's also like the current campaign of boycott, divestment, sanctions. It was developed, the technique, or the strategy rather, of South African divestment was developed in coordination with organizers on the ground in South Africa. So this was something that, South African trade union organizers and other anti-apartheid militants were telling their allies in the West, if you want to help us, you should start attacking the money, start attacking the flow of money that's coming from your countries and your institutions into the government that's oppressing us. Matt, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the BDS movement.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something really quick, that there's just that's another similarity of this, and that there's almost a similar and comparative timeline to the way that these things kind of emerge on the ground in South Africa and in conjunction with organized labor in the States, and the way it's happened in the past 20 years in relation to Palestine. So like Labor for Palestine, which has a Bay Area chapter that's been pretty active in the last several months, organizing and participating in rallies. Labor for Palestine was founded in 2004 in New York and then kind of spread around the country. Also, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or PACB, was founded in the spring of 2004. Again, this happened in coordination and with direct communication with Palestinian organizers in Palestine. And then the BDS movement really kicks off in 2005. So there's this Palestinian BDS National Committee that's established at a conference in Ramallah in November 2007. And so these things are always kind of these are not obviously just organically, U.S. movements. They happen internationally through connections with organizers on the ground in their respective countries. And I think that's obviously, there's a lot of connections today between organizers and groups like Palestinian Youth Movement, communicating with folks on the ground and who are directly connected to the organizers in Palestine.
Yeah, thank you for that background. I mean, I think we need look no further than the fact that the Zionist side of things has been trying for years to outlaw BDS as something that local governments in California and that colleges, universities can engage in to sort of take that off the table. So anytime you hear like sort of bad faith critique of divestment, that divestment isn't a winning strategy, you have to wonder, why are the Zionists so intent on, ending BDS?
The one thing I just wanted to say is that I think Zionists know that the university is a really critical battleground. That's why I think there's such a strong reaction to this movement. One, because it really maps on to the timeline, the kind of divestment campaign for South Africa, and then shortly after, imminent fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa. I think Matt might recall, and I do too, being Santa Cruz for some of our, for early kind of maybe a BDS kind of demonstration in 2012 or 13, which had 15 people at it and was horribly harassed by Zionist students. So it is, I think, really, this is a long struggle. It's been going on for a long time, but this is kind of a high point right now. And the movement has become a mass movement in the country, and Zionists are crucially aware of that and understand it as a direct threat.
Yeah. As far as the opposition that you mentioned to South African divestment, it's worth saying that what the students are dealing with right now is a much more uphill battle than what the students faced then. The opposition to South African divestment was pretty fierce, and there were definitely legal challenges to divestment, to its constitutionality, things like that ultimately failed. But the vast majority of opposition to South African divestment expressed itself in this kind of oh yes, apartheid's so horrible, but if you disinvest from the country, then it's only going to hurt poor Black people even more. It's just going to make conditions even worse. And there was some sort of outright racist kind of attacks on it, particularly from more right-wing elements. But for the most part, students who were concerned about South African apartheid were not smeared as anti-white bigots. There was not a big emotional investment in the South African regime, really, in much of the country. What the students are facing now is, and they didn't have to deal with these laws that BDS campaigners have to deal with now, which effectively outlaw divesting from Israel in numerous states and municipalities too, I'm sure. So it's worth stating that although, the students in the 80s really had to bravely confront a lot of pretty tough opposition, they didn't have to deal with what the students are dealing with now.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Hello again, this is Tofu, editor of the show, here to talk for a bit to tell y'all about how you can support the show. If you have the extra cash, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/SadFrancisco. You can subscribe now starting at $5 a month. On the Patreon, you'll find all of our past episodes, and our Patreon subscribers will have early access to episodes a couple of days before it goes live on our regular platforms. Don't forget to follow us on our TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube channel for additional content and to get updates about the show. And if you're listening on audio platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, go ahead and give us a rating. It really helps us, and it allows the podcast to be recommended to more people on these platforms. That's it for me. Thank you for everyone for the support, and now back to the episode of Sad Francisco.
Also in your piece, which is in notes from below online, and again, we'll link to it in the show notes, you talk about how the unions supported the South African movement. Could you speak to the importance of unions in that movement and then also in what's happening today?
Yeah, definitely. I think first I would probably want to articulate that the union movement in the Bay Area against apartheid was more in a leadership role than in a support role. particularly at the beginning. So in 1976 in South Africa, they have what's referred to as the Soweto Uprising, where tens of thousands of Black school children in this little township called Soweto explode in rebellion against this new law that school instruction is going to be conducted in Afrikaans, which is the language of the oppressor, as they put it at the time. And hundreds are killed. It's a brutally put down, incredibly inspiring uprising. It has a lot in common, really, with the first Intifada, which I think more and more people are becoming familiar with, where you have a lot of young people with stones in their hands going up against armed police and military. And so at the same time, 76, 77, the students in California really kind of begin the first wave of what becomes the South Africa divestment movement there. You also get union activity, particularly in the ILWU, which is the Longshore Union on the West Coast. The Bay Area locals are historically left-led. They had a lot of communist leadership in there when they were founded in the 1930s, and historically they're extremely progressive locals who have always been willing to kind of take a stand on international issues. Famously, they refused to load scrap iron that was being sent to Japan during World War II in solidarity with Chinese people who were dealing with Japanese military aggression. Recently, they have at times refused to unload Israeli cargo. Well, in the 70s, a group gets set up within ILWU Local 10, which is based in San Francisco, that's called the Southern Africa Liberation Support Committee. The book to read on this, by the way, is a book by Peter Cole called Dock Worker Power that really, what we've written here, we couldn't have written without the work that Peter Cole's done. He's an extremely impressive historian who's written about radical labor activity on various waterfronts, so West Coast, Philadelphia, and South Africa. So can't recommend that enough. So in 76, yes, good, I'm glad. 76, 77, the Southern African Liberation Support Committee gets founded within ILWU Local 10. Now, a good number of the longshoremen who found the Southern African Liberation Support Committee are themselves radicals, left-wing radicals, and a lot of them are members of the Communist Party. A number of them have been involved with left-wing activity since the 1960s. Leo Robinson, who's one of the key founders of the Southern African Liberation Support Committee, got involved in the Communist Party because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. Bill Proctor is another who was involved from the early 60s when he got involved because of their civil rights movement. So these radical longshoremen form this committee that begins to agitate within the local to take a more militant attitude towards what's going on in not just South Africa, but Southern Africa as a whole, where sort of racist colonial oppression is being vigorously combated in other places like Angola and all over the region. In 84, this group manages to organize longshoremen outside of their group to refuse to unload South African cargo from a cargo ship called the Ned Lloyd Kimberley. And they hold out for several days. Do you remember how long it is, Matt? How long they don't unload from the Ned Lloyd Kimberley?
Yeah, it's 11 days.
Yeah, so they're there for 11 days. They don't have the support from the union's international leadership. They're really just doing this on their own. This is not a legally sanctioned strike. They're just refusing, simply out of solidarity with the people of South Africa, to move these goods. And so the people who run the port, they go to the courts, and the courts issue an injunction, and they say, look, this is an illegal labor action. They threaten the local leadership with jail time if they don't, stop. And they say, okay, they sort of made their point, and they unload the cargo. But it doesn't stop there, the activity at the port. After that, a group gets formed called the Bay Area Free South Africa Movement, part of which is the Bay Area Free South Africa Labor Committee. The Bay Area Free South Africa Labor Committee is also headed up by a Communist Party member named David Bacon. And the Bay Area Free South Africa Movement, of which it's a constituent part, is headed up by a liberal politician, a progressive Black politician named John George, whose name you might recognize because it's on the psychiatric hospital in the East Bay, and a guy named Franklin Alexander, who also is a member of the Communist Party. And not only is Franklin Alexander a member of the Communist Party, he was one of the founders of the Che Lumumba Club in Los Angeles, which he founded along with his wife, Kendra Alexander, and his sister, who had been a Communist Party member since the 1940s when she joined because of its civil rights work. The Che Lumumba Club was this very militant, pretty small, all-black Communist Party grouping in Los Angeles in the late 60s. They're who recruited Angela Davis into the party. So that's kind of the legacy of leadership that's going into these organizations. A lot of times when people talk about the Communist Party in the Bay Area, they talk about a story that sort of ends in the 1950s and that peaks in the 1930s with communist involvement in the 1934 general strike. But if you look closely at who's participating in leading roles in the anti-apartheid movement in the Bay Area, you find time and time again that they're either members of the Communist Party or they're very, very close to members of the Communist Party. And they're operating a lot of the time not in formal leadership roles, but in these kind of rank and file agitational positions. So the Bay Area Free South Africa movement organizes these pickets that continue to go on at the port after the Ned Lloyd Kimberley has been loaded up and sent away. And they show up every day for weeks and weeks and weeks, demanding that the port stop accepting South African cargo. So it's in that context that a big rally is held at UC Berkeley in solidarity with the longshoremen who have been leading this fight. And it's at this rally that the movement that ends up succeeding in causing UC divestment from South Africa really, really kicks off.
You love to hear it. Yeah, just one of these stories that makes me excited to live in the Bay Area. And I know that there's so many other stories that you all have unearthed that give me that same kind of feeling. In this piece, the piece ends with you like laying out some of what I feel like could be I should incorporate as like personal mantras that are takeaways from the South African apartheid struggle that maybe like younger activists today or like people that are just coming to movement work might also like take something away from. Would you all want to run through those 4 takeaways real quick?
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, they're not exactly mantras. Someone could probably rewrite them better than we did ourselves, go into a mantra form. But these are just kind of like, yeah, some potential lessons that student organizers today might draw. And I think, are probably already realizing themselves. But the kind of 4 that we outline are, I'll just quote directly from the piece. 1, their best weapons are guns and money. Ours are solidarity and courage. And in that, we kind of, just really emphasize the collaborative role between student activism and organized labor to really try to just highlight that it's organized workers' power that really bring some of these complex institutions to a halt. So that's 1. 2
sorry to interrupt, but something that I failed to mention just now is that after the movement gets kicked off at Berkeley, it's not just like there's longshoremen and then there's students. It's also workers get organized as part of this struggle on campus too. And you see Ask Me, who are at the time like the big sort of workers union on campus. As far as I know, they don't strike, which we're starting to see now at the UC as part of this struggle. But they do organize these sort of militant sit-ins. And union members go out and get arrested intentionally, blocking buildings and stuff. You also get grad student organization and faculty organization, all of whom themselves organize their own little direct actions as part of the movement. So the labor component is actually quite large. And in the way that the students are inspired by the dock workers, the workers on campus are then inspired by the students. And there's this kind of contagious effect that solidarity like so often has.
Yeah, and I think just the graduate student and kind of student strikes organized at Berkeley in the 80s are obviously in some ways kind of being played out again. Like, UAW 4811 called a statewide, or rather voted for a statewide stand-up strike. It is now calling one by one, hopefully, various campuses to strike. Students at UC Santa Cruz went on strike on Monday. I mean, these are just kind of some, like Matt said, contagious tactics that are, kind of being reproduced again today. But getting back to the lessons, so the kind of second one that we outlined was just not to be discouraged by failures and setbacks in the movement, because these things, the struggles kind of come in waves. And I think that, that you could see that when you look between the 1960s and 80s, the kind of movement and solidarity for South Africa developed. It really like petered out. There wasn't a lot going on, for instance, on college campuses in the early 1980s. But 4 years later, there's this huge kind of 2-year movement that ends in some of the biggest divestment victories of that moment. And, you know, I mean, not to say that I think we also want to combat this kind of narrative that change only comes gradually, that a lot of people like to repeat, tamper down on movement mobilizations, but to remember that building social movements, building capacity for movements is a long-term project.
And also that those waves occur in the context of the movement upsurges themselves, right? So in the initial explosion in the mid 80s at Berkeley, you know, a bunch of students occupy the building, they get arrested, there's some activity, and the regents make a kind of mealy-mouthed promise to sort of look into the problem and vote on whether or not they're going to do something about it sometime down the road. And the movement sort of does recede for a while. And then the following year, it comes back, it picks up again. They don't even give the regents time to follow through with their stupid promise that they made. They just say, fuck it, we're starting again. And they do. And then that makes it through the end of the school year with another mealy-mouthed promise of a different sort. They say, we're going to look into selective divestment. And the movement goes away for the summer. And a lot of people participating in it think, well, that's it. We've lost. It's over. And then the next school year, it takes a little while, but then people start coming out again and they start making the same demand. And it explodes again. And this time it explodes the hardest way it has so far. There's like street fighting between the police and the students. It gets pretty heavy. And then after that, they win. So it's not just that on a long historical timeline, these things ebb and flow, but also in the immediate moment. If it looks like a movement sort of over and receding, it does not mean that it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to remember, you know, inevitable, like what seem like low points in movements that are crucial and necessary. There will inevitably, you know, there will be more resistance on the way. The next one that you laid out are kind of is kind of related to that, which is to tune out the wisdom of naysayers, the haters, which always exist. Today, we need look no further than the corporate news media for a reassurance that the work that people in the Palestinian liberation struggle is, you know, meaningless and it's not going to do anything. You know, open up the New York Times website and you can be reassured of that on the regular. And this is something that is consistent between resistance struggles. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely fuck the haters. And yeah, they're a constant. I mean, again, like Matt said, there is a difference between what's going on now and what was going on in the 1980s. There was a lot of, you know, racist, kind of paternalistic and pedantic, you know, letter to the editor submissions, you know, filled with kind of misses, accusing students of not really knowing what they're talking about, or not understanding the complexities of international relations when it came to South Africa. There was not an enormous and outrageous smear campaign accusing them of anti-Semitism, which is going on now and is really the only thing you hear if you turn on cable news about what's going on student campuses. Obviously, if you've been visit any of these student encampments, you see that a large contingent of Jewish students on campus holding often Shabbat dinners in collaboration with Muslim prayer sessions, et cetera, are not, you know, these kind of rabid anti-Semites. That's still the narrative that's being projected. And there are a lot of attempts to ruin the lives of these students, you know, submitting their names to JewHaters.com or whatever. So that is a difference, though. Like we're saying, like this kind of naysayer is a constant. And it's important to remember that the struggle for, you know, even though it's kind of celebrated today, the end of apartheid, it was not a popular position to take in the 1980s.
Yeah, helpful to remember for sure. And then last, consistency, persistence, building for the long term.
So this is something that we didn't really get a chance or time to touch on earlier, but I think is really important to understanding what happened in this particular struggle in the Bay Area, which is that it wasn't just, you know, we've talked a lot about unions, we've talked a lot about, you know, left wingers and left radicals, we've talked a lot about students, but there were also, sorry to say it, very committed and relatively committed progressive politicians in the Bay Area that had been elected, a lot of them out of, in one way or another, the movements of the 1960s. So you had Ron Dellums, a congressman who now many will remember as the ineffectual face of the city of Oakland during the Oscar Grant movement, but at the time was, quite probably the most left-wing politician in the country, who was elected first to Berkeley City Council with the help of, the Black Panther Party and the anti-war movement, and then went to Congress. He was the first person to submit divestment legislation congressionally in the early 70s, which of course at the time went nowhere. So you had Dellums, you had the mayor of Berkeley was this guy, Gus Newport, who himself had a quite impressive left-wing pedigree. He was a member of Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was very involved in the anti-war movement. He was elected along with a whole slate of sort of left progressive anti-war liberals to Berkeley City Council, and had really made an effort to use the mayor's office and to use city government as a way to speak out about and affect foreign policy. He made official visits to Nicaragua and El Salvador when he was in office, and was a staunch ally from the get-go of the divestment movement, and really used his credibility and the resources of the mayor's office to do what he could to aid the students. He was out there getting arrested with them, encouraging them in their tactic of, civil disobedience. And then, so that combined with the longshoremen, the ILWU, and, the Communist Party and anti-war movement involvement in that. And in turn, with the student movement, which was very aware of its legacy coming out of the 1960s, these students were, very conscious of that. They were inviting people like Mario Savio from the free speech movement to their rallies. You get a total picture of this kind of movement ecosystem in the Bay Area in the mid-1980s, which is not a time that people think of as a radical time. But because there were all of these institutions that had been built in earlier moments of mass struggle, and because there were all of these individual people who had been shaped by those struggles and who were now in positions, some of them in relative positions of power, some of them even in the mayor's office, but a lot of them just rank and file militants in, Ask Me campus unions, or in the Teamsters Union, or in the Molders, or maybe they were professors, or they were teachers' assistants. There was this tremendous institutional memory about previous movements, about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. And that enabled a kind of symbiotic working together between these different groups and different institutions and tendencies that on the face of them might not have had that much in common, but they shared these kind of interwoven movement legacies. And it's that really enabled the movement to be as successful as it was in the Bay Area. And so when we participate in struggles today, I think it behooves us to look around and try to figure out what's been built before us that we can connect to, because there's always something. And B, to keep in mind that we need to think about the long term in that same way when we build institutions out of our own movement. I think this often kind of gets forgotten when there's a focus on just the immediate fortunes of the movement itself, that these are all kind of long-term projects that intersect in various different ways.
One really incredible thing that happens to 4 years after UC Berkeley divests, Nelson Mandela goes on an 8 citywide tour of the United States in 1990, which ends in Oakland. And there's about 60,000 people that come to the Oakland Coliseum to hear him talk. And during that talk, he basically thanks the ILWU and gives them a salute. There's a lot of Local 10 members and Local 34 members in the crowd. Says that they established themselves as the front line of the anti-apartheid movement in the Bay Area. 4 years later, he becomes the first president of South Africa. And 3 years after that, on the International Day of Solidarity with Palestine, delivers this line, which we quote at the top of our paper, which is that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians.
Yeah, that's, I feel like, a really good note to go out on. There's always something that has happened in the past that we can connect to what's happening right now. Thank you, Matt, for writing this piece and for tracking some of these histories that are really a reason why I love living in the Bay.
We really appreciate you having us on to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Please come back. You have so many other pieces of history that you've uncovered from the history in the Bay that I think people would be stoked to learn about. And other than directing people to your Twitter and Instagram, anywhere else that people can watch out for y'all?
We will have a website soon, leftinthebay.com. So folks can look there. We're going to develop some different stuff that I won't announce now on the website, but we will have a blog. We really want to encourage folks to write for that. We're really looking forward to publishing stuff that just doesn't really make sense to throw up Instagram and Twitter, kind of archival pieces of writing that don't really see the light of day anymore. But it'll also be a place to kind of archive our own posts on social media, because who knows what'll happen with that.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, otherwise, we just really encourage people to kind of explore on their own, dig around in the archives, check out the kind of resources we talked about earlier. Like I said, we're no experts ourselves. We have a lot to learn. And as the piece itself notes, these students right now engaging in struggle, and everyone engaging in kind of solidarity struggles with the war on Palestine. It's their turn to teach right now, and we're learning a lot.
Thank you. And we'll definitely signal boost the events that you have coming up. I'm stoked about that as well. And I guess that's it. Talk to you again soon.
Sick. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you have it, please throw us a few dollars through patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which will help us pay for podcast hosting, editing, and transcriptions for the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.